Before presenting the second program on Masada, I'll briefly recap the first. As you see on this map, we saw that Masada is situated on the southwest coast of the Dead Sea. It's a majestic, high rocky tableland that has cliffs rising over 400 metres. And in 37 BC, Herod the Great, king of Judea, reinforced it, making it an impregnable stronghold for himself. After Herod's death in 4 BC, a Roman garrison was stationed at Masada, and this occupation continued till AD 66, when the Jewish zealots made a lightning raid on Masada, displaced the Romans, and took the fortress over. During the next few years, more and more Jews fled to Masada from Roman rule, making a total of nearly 1,000. But in AD 72, Flavius Silva, the Roman general, took his 10th legion and thousands of Jewish prisoners, and he laid siege to Masada. The Romans surrounded Masada at the base with a siege wall and 8 military camps, as depicted on this diagram, as I showed in the first program. They then proceeded to build a massive ramp on the west face, which is still clearly visible today, as you see in this picture. And here it is again, closer up, looking more from the base. When the ramp was built, an ironclad tower and battering ram were winched up to a stone platform at the top of the fortress, and they pounded its way through the wall, and fiery arrows set the wooden reinforcing on fire. The Jews realised they were going to be defeated, so they committed suicide rather than fall into the hands of the Romans. In a remarkable discovery, the excavators uncovered these 11 sherds, each inscribed with a different name, believed to be the actual lots used in that final deadly lottery. Over the next 19 centuries, after the Romans vandalised and left Masada, the fortress was left to the ravages of nature and deteriorated until the 1950s, when large-scale excavations began, revealing the original structures dating back to Herod's time. At Masada's most northern tip, we saw the remnant of Herod's 3-tiered royal vista. The original 3-tiered royal vista looked something like this. And in the first program, we saw the remnants of the mosaic floors, marble columns, ornate capitals, and other architectural embellishments. Attention was also drawn to rows of openings or caves up the side of the fortress, one row above the other, as you see here. They proved to be openings to huge square cisterns which had been dug out of the rock, into which rainwater was diverted along channels carved out of the side of the mountains. On the western side of the mountain, we saw the ruins of the main official ceremonial administrative palace of Herod, which had obviously been richly decorated. This is it here. It was the largest building on the summit, and in it were sumptuous apartments, luxurious bathrooms, mosaic floors, a large kitchen with huge cooking stoves, etc. To the north of the Western Palace, we saw the ruins of a chapel of the Byzantine period. This is it in here. Here it is after excavation and after reconstruction had taken place. Attention was also drawn to the position of a swimming pool just south of the palace, which you can see pointed out in here. Here it is after excavation and after reconstruction took place. It was also pointed out on this plan that a bathhouse originally stood in front of the northern palace villa, and you can see it mentioned here. The excavators knew that it was a bathhouse due to the round clay brick pillars they uncovered, which belonged to an underground heating chamber. We concluded the first program on Masada by looking at the bathhouse. South and east of that, that's above it and to the right of it in this picture, coloured in red, talking about here and here, is the storerooms complex consisting of two rectangular buildings constructed of stone slabs. The smaller one contained 4 long, narrow rooms. The larger complex had 10. The two complexes were separated by a road which ran from east to west, as you see it down here. This is an aerial view of what the storeroom complex looked like before excavation. The long, narrow rooms are clearly discernible in spite of the bad state of disrepair that they had fallen into. The large bathhouse ruins can also be seen in the lower centre area in here. And this is an aerial view after excavation and reconstruction showing the well-planned layout of it. And we're looking up here, of course. The large rectangular structures have been accepted by most scholars as the storehouses built by Herod and described by Josephus as being full of large quantities of food and all varieties. Here's just a couple of pictures of artists' impressions looking at this area here, of course. Josephus also mentions that a large quantity of all sorts of weapons of war, sufficient for 10,000 men, was stored here, ready for any occasion that called for them. None of the weapons were actually found in the storehouses by the archaeologists. Here we're looking down one of the storerooms, probably built to store wine or other liquids. Note the plastered floors and walls and the round depression in the floor. It was easy to identify these buildings, for throughout the ages, storehouses were always long, narrow halls, almost without openings. These buildings were in a state of almost complete destruction. It took a lot of hard work to excavate and to reconstruct them. They were built of hard dolomite stone, quarried on the site, and because of its toughness, the stone was not dressed to a fine smoothness. The masons satisfied themselves with the coarse fashioning of corners on each slab, sufficient to enable them to be used for building. The walls were built up in double rows of these stone slabs so that the thickness of a wall was double the width of a slab. The slabs were large, each weighing around 1/4 of a tonne, or that's from 400 to 500 pounds. So cranes were hauled up to Masada and expert builders to hoist the stones into position. The cranes had to be of the manual kind with tripod, pulley and chain, so that Masada looked more like an oil drilling area than an archaeological site. Herod's engineers would have used Roman cranes, which had the same basic construction. The task of removing some of the boulders and debris required the use of tractors, which, of course, could not be driven up to the summit of Masada. So they took them apart and sent each section to the top by an overhead cable rail, which was installed by Israeli engineers and then reassembled on the top. During the excavation of the storerooms, hundreds of scattered vessels lay over the floor among the thick ash and charred beams. These vessels had contained oil, wine, flour, etc., each indicated by its own particular shape, and some contained remnants of food. Each storeroom held exclusively its own type of vessel, showing how the storage system was organised. Many jars bore labels describing their contents in Aramaic or in Hebrew. And it was evident that the vessels had not been broken by the falling beams when the roof collapsed in the big fire started by the Zealots, but had actually been intentionally smashed to prevent the Romans from enjoying their contents. In one of the storerooms, the excavators found stocks of tin and other metals as mentioned by Josephus. They also came across a few storerooms which were completely empty with no vessels and no sign of fire. This discovery of some storerooms and their food vessels being burned by fire and others not burned explains the report of Josephus. He records the stores were not burned by the Jewish zealots to show the Romans that they died by their own free choice and not through lack of food. In order to achieve this purpose, the zealots didn't need to leave all their stores of food to the Romans. It was enough for them to leave 1 or 2 rooms with stores of food to show they had not died through lack of food, and they set fire deliberately to the rest. The undamaged storerooms unearthed by the excavators were no doubt the very rooms in which the zealots had left food, which was later eaten by the Romans. Incidentally, the picture on the screen was taken of remains of food that was left by the zealots and found on the lower terrace and other places. At the top we've got dates, walnuts, olive stones, and at the bottom there's salt, grain, and pomegranates. Though the jars were broken, this did not matter from the archaeological point of view because the experts managed to glue most of the pieces together again, as the archaeologists do. From the study of their shapes, it was possible to conclude that many belonged to the Herodian period, but in their final days had been used by the Jewish defenders, for they bore inscriptions in ink and charcoal of Hebrew names, such as you see in the next picture. The name inscribed on this one is Shimeon ben Yosa. The owner probably belonged to a priestly family. Other inscriptions led to the conclusion that the defenders were not all zealots from the national political point of view, but also lived rigidly according to the religious code, strictly adhering to such commandments as tithing, despite the harsh conditions of life at Masada. We know this because several of the vessels carried the letter TAV, which stood for the Hebrew word truma, which means priestly due, and relates to tithing. Talking about storage jars, here's a picture of one that was miraculously preserved intact beneath an accumulation of debris and charred beams. It was found during the process of excavating a street between the storehouses. Nearly 100 coins were also found strewn on the floor with a small radius, within a small radius, in the entrance of one of the storeroom chambers and other public buildings. They belonged to the year 2 and 3 of the Jewish revolt. It seemed as though someone, in the final bitter moment, had taken the coins and flung them on the floor as useless objects. In this picture, some of those bronze coins are shown. They bear a vine leaf design on one side and a chalice on the other. The inscription reads, "For the freedom of Zion." The weapons of the zealots, who used mainly bows and arrows, were also discovered in many locations. Hundreds of arrows were found in such places as the middle terrace of the palace villa, the western palace, and elsewhere, literally in heaps where they had been piled and intentionally set on fire. Only very few weapons for hand-to-hand fighting, like sword and spear, were found. The most effective defense weapon on the walls of the summit was, of course, the bow and arrow. The Romans also had bows and arrows, and these ones on the screen were found near Masada. When the excavators cleared away the pile of debris which covered the chambers of the small bathhouse, they came across the remains of 3 skeletons upon the steps leading to the cold water pool on the ground nearby. One was that of a man about 20, probably zealot warrior. Next to it were found hundreds of silvered scales of armour that you're looking at here. Also scores of arrows, fragments of a prayer shawl, and also an inscribed potsherd with Hebrew letters. Not far from the young man's skeleton, and also on the steps, was the skeleton of a young woman, with her scalp preserved intact because of the extreme dryness of the atmosphere. Her hair, beautifully plaited, looked as if it had been freshly done. Next to it, the plaster was stained with what looked like blood. By her side were delicately fashioned ladies' sandals, styled in the traditional pattern of that period. The third skeleton was that of a child. There could be no doubt that these were the remains of some of the Jewish defenders of Masada. In this case, probably a young man and his wife and child. The next ruin we come across as we move southwards from the storehouses is that of a square building outlined in blue on this plan. It was a large apartment or garrison building consisting of many identical living quarters built around a large central court. Each dwelling unit had a private court and 2 small rooms. Quite a similar design actually to some motels. Its general outline was apparent even before excavation started, as is evident from this aerial photograph. The garrison building is between the storerooms and the palace, around here. Here's a closer aerial picture of it, and here. There can be little doubt that the garrison or apartment building housed the top administrators of Masada, or perhaps officials, or even garrison troops. This is the artist's impression of it, and here. And it became clear during excavation that in the period of the Jewish revolt, some of the most important Jewish leaders actually lived here. This conclusion is based not just on the numerous alabaster vessels and handsome cosmetic appurtenances found in several of the rooms, but also on a rather exciting find in the northwest wing of the building. Beneath the level of the original floor of the large room of this dwelling unit lay a heap of coins stuck together. And from the colour of the mould clinging to them, it was clear that these were coins of silver. Bits of cloth were still stuck to part of the heap, and it was evident that the coins had originally been placed in a special bag beneath the floor. Only after cleaning them was it realised how considerable and in what superb condition the treasure was. It consisted of silver shekels and half shekels, 38 altogether. Closer examination showed that these coins had almost never been in use. Many of them, in fact, had been struck in the year 4 of the revolt, that is, 1 year before the final one. Close by, among a thick layer of ashes, another hoard was found several weeks later, consisting of 6 shekels and 6.5 shekels in a special bronze box. These coins, too, must have been hidden to prevent them falling into the hands of the Romans, unlike the bronze ones, which were scattered all over the place. A third hoard was later found in one of the chambers of the casement wall. These finds constituted the largest group of shekels ever found in one location, and the stratum in which they were found clearly belonged to the period of the Great Jewish Revolt. The shekels found represent all the years of the revolt, from the year 1 to the very rare year 5, the last year the shekel was struck, corresponding to the year AD 70, when the city and temple of Jerusalem were destroyed. These are some of the coins here. Starting with the top row on the left, we have the year 2 shekel, and the one next to it is year 3, and the next two show the other side. In the bottom row, the first one is year 4, and the one next to it is year 5, and the other two show the reverse side. And here we have both sides of a bronze coin, which was one of a series struck in AD 71 by the Romans to commemorate their victories over the Jews. The bust depicts Vespasian, the emperor of Rome, surrounded by his abbreviated Latin title. The reverse side bears two figures flanking a palm tree. On the left is an upright Roman soldier, on the right a mourning woman, symbolizing defeated Judea. The inscription around these two figures reads, Judea Capta, which means captured Judea. At the center bottom are the letters SC, standing for Senatus Consulto. SC was stamped on bronze coins produced at the imperial mint to show they were minted with the assent of the Roman Senate. This picture was taken of one of the coins in the Israel Museum. Except for the northern tip of Masada, the entire summit was enclosed by a casement wall, that is, a double wall with the inner space divided into rooms by partitioning walls. You can see the outline of the wall in these pictures running around the top edge of a section of the Masada mountain. Herod had encircled the entire top plateau with such a wall, 1,372 metres long. That's about 4,500 feet long, 4 metres, about 13 feet wide, and up to 6 metres, about 20 feet high, with 4 gates, 30 defence towers, all coated with white plaster. Here's a section of the double wall. Altogether, there were 110 rooms in the wall and towers used as storerooms and dwelling places for Herod's troops. They varied in size, ranging in length from 5.5 metres to 34.5. That's 18 feet to 114 feet. The medium size averaged 12 metres to 15, that's 39 feet to 48, and the Jewish zealots used these chambers in the wall for dwellings. And as a result of excavation, some interesting things were found. Small heaps of embers in all the rooms told the story how just before the end, each family had collected together its humble belongings and set them all on fire. Excavation was very difficult because the wall had collapsed along the entire length. Some of the rocks had fallen outwards over the precipice, some had fallen inwards, so that the whole wall with its chambers looked like a huge chain of stones winding its way around the edge of Masada. Scores of volunteers worked for 11 months to clear the ruins, and this picture shows a section of the southern wall before excavation. Due to their collapse, it was impossible to make out the double walls. Here's the same section after excavation and reconstruction, showing the 2 parallel walls and mud-plastered floor. Many domestic vessels were found strewn about the floors, some of which I'll show you in fairly quick succession. This plaited palm frond basket found in one of the casements was most probably made from palms grown in the nearby oasis of En-Gedi. There were these ivory and bone objects, egg spoons at the top, a spindle wheel on the left and a dice on the right, a spindle stick in the middle and spatula at the bottom. It's an instrument for working pigments, etc. This bronze pan and jug were found hidden under the floors of the casement wall. Clay oil lamps, typical of the 1st century, were also found. Scores of them were found, in fact, in various rooms belonging to the zealots. And this is a cosmetic palette made of a shell. Here's some cosmetic equipment also found in the zealots' dwellings. From left to right, we have a twin pallet, 2 bronze eyeshadow sticks, clay perfume bottles, bronze mirror case, and a wooden comb. It's evident from the cosmetic gear that was found that although the zealots were living in a harsh and isolated environment, the women still took some pride in themselves to look neat and attractive and didn't just let themselves go. Various bronze objects such as these were found also. On the left is a fibula, 2 buckles are in the middle, and top right is a knob, bottom right is a ring key. Collection of signet rings was discovered as well. You see some of them here. In the bottom row, the 2 on the left are of gold. Talking about gold, this gold breastplate containing semi-precious stones was also found. Also various vessels made of soft stone, including measuring mugs and bowls, in which marks from the carving instrument and lathe were still visible. Outmanned and outgunned, the zealots relied on ingenuity to stave off the Roman onslaught. Taking advantage of their high ground and the plentiful supply of rocks, they apparently set up a catapult on top of a tower and bombarded the Romans, slowing down their progress and thereby gaining time for their countermeasure, that is, the building of the reinforcing wall. The spherical stones seen in these pictures, resembling cannonballs, were found by the excavators in the rubble along the wall where the tower used to be. At several of the key strategic points along the wall, huge round stones like these, weighing about 45 kilograms, about 100 pounds, were found on the floors of the rooms. It seems that these stones were kept on the roof, that is, on top of the casement wall, and fell through when the wall caved in. In the event of being rolled down the slopes, they would certainly have proved lethal to anyone trying to clamber up and reach the summit by the customary routes. Yet it was clear that such weapons had never been used. The reason for this is because the Romans chose to assault Masada at one point alone on the western side where they built the ramp and erected at the head of it siege towers and catapults. Here we see a replica of a Roman siege engine which is kept on view near Masada. The catapult, seen again here, was designed to shoot spears or heavy stones over the wall into a city. The ballista, as they called it, could actually sling heavy stones for about 700 metres, that's 2,300 feet. And the onager could cast light stones for about 400 metres, about 1,300 feet. All around the section of the fortress, above the ramp, were hundreds of ballistic stones which had been hurled at Masada by the Roman catapults. Many of them, no doubt, got sent back down on the Romans by the Jewish zealots. These Roman-age catapult stones were found on another archaeological site. Large stones such as these, hurled from mobile wooden machines, helped the Roman legions breach the walls of Jerusalem as well as Masada. Their destructive power is indicated in the smashed stone defence tower that you see in the background there. In one of the chambers in the southern section of the casement wall, right on the edge of the steep cliff, much to the surprise of the excavators, they had uncovered 3 adjacent pools, one large, one medium-sized, and one small, as seen in this picture. Steps had been built in the 2 larger pools so that one could reach the bottom, and in the wall between them there was a connecting hole through which the water could flow from one end to the other. Moreover, as you can see in this drawing, there was an open plastered water conduit number 1 in the bottom left corner. Leading into the first and largest pool, it's number 2 in the top left, and the conduit no doubt served to collect and channel rainwater from the roof of the room and its surroundings. The find immediately suggested to the excavators they had discovered a ritual immersion bath called a mikveh in Hebrew, and they announced this at their routine press conference at the time. News spread quickly and aroused interest, particularly in Orthodox religious circles, for the traditional Jewish laws of the Talmud relating to the ritual bath are quite complex, and no mikveh had, at that stage, been discovered, that is, belonging to the temple period, that is, the 1st century. They have since, of course, at Qumran, also at Jerusalem, where this particular picture on the screen was taken. The discovery at Masada resulted in some rabbis, specialists in the law of the mikveh, visiting the site to inspect the baths. They showed no interest in anything else on the mountain except this. As soon as they arrived, they got straight into one of the pools with a tape measure, as captured in this photo on the screen, to see whether or not the volume was the 40 measures required by their ritual law. When he'd completed his study, he announced with beaming face, this mikveh was indeed a ritual bath. He said, among the finest of the finest, 7 times 7, constructed according to ritual regulations. It illustrated once again, as did the inscriptions on vessels relating to tithes that I mentioned earlier, that the defenders of Masada were devout Jews. They scrupulously conformed to the instructions or injunctions of traditional Jewish law. Here's a picture of another pool found at Masada with steps going down into it. I'm not sure where this one is situated, but it's not a mikveh. Could be, in fact, a Christian baptismal pool built long after. From an historical point of view, the most exciting and significant discovery at Masada were scrolls found in the casement walls. In one room, after clearing more than 2 meters of debris, a large collection of vessels, cloth, mats, baskets, and leather articles were found. Also, strewn over a small area of the floor were 17 silver shekels in excellent condition. The markings on them were year 1 up to and including year 5. Each one signified in which year of the revolt the coin had been struck. All the years were represented in this find. The coins were minted in Jerusalem, and the fact that none have been found with markings after AD 70 agrees with history that Jerusalem was destroyed in AD 70. Up until this discovery at Masada, shekels of year 5 were very rare, as I mentioned earlier. Only 6 were known to exist, but among the 17 found in the wall, 3 of them were the year 5. About 1 meter away, the first scroll was found, with several coins actually on it. It was a fragment from the book of Psalms, and the chapters could be identified. The section was Psalm 81 through to Psalm 85. This discovery was of immense significance and importance as far as scroll research was concerned. It was the first time that a parchment scroll had been found in circumstances where it was possible to date it without the slightest doubt. More effective testimony for dating a scroll could not have been hoped for. It could not possibly have been younger than 73 AD, the year Masada fell. As a matter of fact, the scroll was written much before, perhaps 20 or 30 years or more before. And it's interesting that the wording in the section from the book of Psalms was practically identical to the text of the Psalms that we have in the manuscripts of our Bible today. Even the division into chapters and Psalms is identical with the traditional division. In the same room, in the casement wall, another few fragments of scrolls were also found, among them one from the book of Leviticus. A scroll that caused considerable surprise was one that had exactly the same text as one of the sectarian scrolls found belonging to the Essenes that was discovered at Qumran. The big question was, what had this sectarian scroll of the Essenes to do with Masada? It's generally agreed among authorities who have studied the Essene movement in depth that they took part in the Zealots' revolt against the Romans. Josephus lists John the Essene as one of the commanders of the revolt. After the settlement of the Essenes at Qumran was destroyed by the Romans, Masada to the south remained the only Jewish stronghold and outpost against the Romans. So it's more than likely fugitives from Qumran, Qumran is seen here, fled there, and it would be natural for them to take holy writings with them. In another section of the wall, in the eastern sector, more scrolls were found. A piece of white leather containing the last chapter of the book of Psalms, as well as a copy of Ecclesiastes. A portion of the scroll is seen on the screen here. This picture was actually taken just as it was found. A seam can be seen between two sheets of the scroll. A small scroll was also found in the ruins of one of the wall towers to the west of the Western Palace. Parts of the scroll had been eaten away, but those that were undamaged were well preserved and could be identified with several chapters from the book of Leviticus, chapters 8 to 12. This scroll was also identical with the traditional text of Leviticus that we have in our Bible today. There could be no doubt that the text in our Bible was practically identical to the original manuscripts which were written under the inspiration of God. During the first season of excavations, while digging in the northwestern section of the wall of Masada, the workers came upon a strange structure adjoining the wall. It was so close that it seemed part of the wall, even though it projected inwards inside Masada. You can see it here after excavation. We're talking about this building here. It turned out to be the remains of a synagogue, the position of which can be seen on this plan. The red dot up there is actually shows you the position of that synagogue. Early in the dig, they noticed what looked like benches plastered with clay protruding from the debris inside the building next to the walls. Gradually, pillars began to appear, made in sections, and when excavation was finished, a rectangular building was before them, with benches all around the walls, tier upon tier, all plastered with clay, as you see in this picture here. On the eastern side, there was an opening. In the centre were 2 rows of columns, 3 columns in the southern row and 2 in the northern. It became clear that the synagogue had gone through various stages of use and modifications in structure. The benches had been added by the Zealots. It was made of dressed stone taken from other buildings that were made in Herod's day. The structure had the character of a communal building and was obviously designed for public gatherings. The fact that the entrance faced east and it was wholly oriented towards Jerusalem indicated it could be a synagogue. for this was required by the traditional injunction of the sages. Other articles found there also suggested it had been a synagogue. If so, it would be an important discovery because up until then, the earliest synagogues discovered in Israel belonged to the end of the 2nd or the beginning of the 3rd century AD. While making exploratory cuts in the rear sill and examining the filling between the 2 floors, they came across a piece of a rolled scroll, which turned out to be the 2 final chapters of the book of Deuteronomy. How had it got there, and why beneath the floor? When the area was studied more carefully, they found that a pit had once been dug at this spot. The scroll was found at the bottom of the pit, which had later been filled with earth and stones. This had obviously been a kind of geniza. It is a place where Orthodox Jews buried holy documents which had become too old to use. Spurred on by this find, they excavated the whole of the upper floor in the rear sill to see if there were any other pits. After several days' work, another pit was found, and a scroll was unearthed from the bottom of it. Though the parchment was badly gnawed, they were able to immediately identify the writing as chapters from the book of Ezekiel. And the parts that were better preserved than the others, and which could be easily read, contained extracts from Ezekiel chapter 37, which records the prophet's vision of dry bones. He saw this valley full of human bones, which represented the dead and dispersed nation of Israel. So difficult was it at that time to believe that the Jews could ever return to their land and revive as a nation, that when the Lord said to Ezekiel, "Can these bones live?" he didn't say yes, he just said, "Well, Lord, you know." The Lord responded by saying, "Prophesy to these bones and say to them, O dry bones, hear the word of the Lord. Behold, I will cause breath to enter you, and you shall live. And I will lay sinews upon you. I will cause flesh to come upon you, and cover you with skin. And you shall know that I am the Lord." And so Ezekiel prophesied to the bones, and there was a great noise of rattling as the bones came together, from which that Negro spiritual song has been developed, of course. Flesh and sinews came upon them, and then breath was breathed into them, and they stood up on their feet as a great army. Then God explained to the prophet what this vision means. It represents the return of the Jews to their own land and the revival or resuscitation of the dead nation of Israel prior to the coming of the Lord Jesus Christ. Ezekiel 37 verse 21 to 22 says, "Behold, I will gather the children of Israel from all nations and bring them into their own land, and I will make them one nation in the land, and one king shall be king over them all." Notice the sequence of events here. Firstly, the Jews would be gathered from all nations into their own land. Secondly, they would become a nation again. And thirdly, a king, that is Messiah, would reign over them. This was definitely not fulfilled by the return of the Jews from Babylon. It happened a long time ago, and they have had no king since then. From this we learn that the return of the Jews to their homeland and the revival of the nation of Israel is a sign of the coming of their Messiah, who will reign not only over them, but indeed over the whole earth, over all nations. Other prophecies talk about the Jews returning in ships, even by air. Isaiah 60 verse 8, for example, refers to them flying as doves to their dovecote openings. And there have indeed been some amazing airlifts of Jews since the Holocaust. In AD 70, the nation of Israel was cut down like a tree by the Romans and burned and scattered to the four winds. But as the stump of a tree can sprout and grow again, so has the Jewish nation in fulfillment of the Bible prophecies. On the screen at the moment is a building symbolic of a tree stump erected on a hillside west of the city of Jerusalem at the John F. Kennedy Memorial as a gesture of the revised Israeli nation. Earlier on in this program, we saw a coin struck in AD 71 by the Romans to commemorate their victory over the Jews. Well, this is another one in the series depicting Vespasian's profile on one side, and the other side shows defeated Judea, portrayed as a woman, seated next to a palm tree, her hands bound behind her back, and below is that inscription, Judea. In 1958, a medal was issued to commemorate the 10th anniversary of the independence of the nation of Israel, and it contradicted the message of the Roman coins. One side of the medal, seen on the left, represents a variation of the Roman coins. It depicts a Roman soldier with helmet and shield standing next to a palm tree. To the right of the tree, a mournful female figure dressed in a toga has laid down her shield. The Hebrew words at the top of the outside border translate, quote, the dispersion of Judea, and the rest of the border is embellished by chains. On the reverse side of the coin, seen on the right, the palm tree is flanked by two Israeli pioneers. In place of the words Judea Capta are the words Israel Liberata. The outside band reads, 10 years for the freedom of Israel. The revival of the nation of Israel has also, of course, resulted in the restoration of the land, which had been abused and neglected over the centuries when the Jews were dispersed throughout the world. Many prophecies predicted this land restoration, and it has involved a lot of hard work, but has produced an amazing transformation. Various prophecies clearly predict that Israel's land would be restored to a very fertile and fruitful state in the end time, prior to Armageddon and the second coming of Jesus. We have witnessed this particularly during the second half of the 20th century, and it continues on into our 21st century. Israel's return to her land and the restoration of it is an outstanding fulfillment of Bible prophecy and sign of the second coming of Christ. Jesus said, when he was asked what the signs of his coming would be, he said in Matthew 24, now learn a parable of the fig tree. When the branch becomes tender and puts forth its leaves, you know summer is near. So likewise, when you see all these things, you will know that my coming is near, even at the very doors. We believe the fig tree in that parable represented Israel, and Jesus was basically saying, when you see the nation revived, you'll know that you're living in the end time period when I shall return. There's no doubt about it, Israel is the key. Israel is the key to Bible prophecy. You dismiss Israel, you close it out of your considerations of Bible prophecy, and you're never going to be able to make proper sense of end time prophecy. Jesus gave many signs of his second coming. The revival of Israel was only one of them. I believe he also predicted the nuclear age, which many fear could result in the extermination of life upon our planet. He said that just before he returns, there would be a time of trouble such as never was in the history of the world. He said there would be fearful sights in the heavens, distress of nations, in perplexity. That word perplexity means no solution, for mankind to be at his wit's end, men's hearts failing for fear because of what is taking place. Jesus said, unless he came back, no living thing on earth would survive. And I mean, these words didn't make sense till our atomic age. I mean, in Jesus' day, total annihilation of life by man was not possible. They only had swords and spears and primitive sort of catapults to use against one another in those days. Well, different story today. We're clearly living in the end time period, on the very threshold of the second coming of Christ. Actually, quite a few prophecies relate to our nuclear age, but we can't dwell on that now. We would need a whole evening to cover that. I mean, for example, Peter in his epistle refers to the heavens being on fire, the elements melting with fervent heat. There's a prophecy in Zechariah 14, talks about eyes melting in their sockets while people are still standing on the feet, which the very thing happened when the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Coming back to the dry bones in the valley, every time I read that chapter in Ezekiel 37, I think of pictures like this, of piles of bodies and bones of Jews in valley-like trenches in the Nazi war camps. If ever there was a time when the Jews felt they had no hope or future and were destined to be cut off, that is, exterminated, it was during that period. And Ezekiel 37 verse 11 actually predicted that this is what they would be thinking and saying to themselves at the times. The words put into their mouths in Ezekiel 37, remember, are these: we have no hope and no future, we are cut off. In those days, when Hitler's war machine was in top gear and Jews were being killed by the millions, it looked like they would be exterminated as a race. That was certainly Hitler's aim and ambition. In those days, it was hard to believe that they would survive, let alone revive as a nation and Nazi Germany be destroyed. Yet, this is what the prophecy in Ezekiel 37 predicted. In spite of the mass of dead bodies and bones, God would not allow the nation to be exterminated. He would see to it that they survived as a race and revive as a nation. He promised this centuries ago in his word. These are the words that he proclaimed: though I make a full end of all nations where I scatter you, yet I will never make a full end of you. Never. That's a challenge to eternity, and it has proved true to this day. Many nations have tried to exterminate the Jews, and they've all failed. Mark Twain said, what is the secret of the Jews' immortality? Well, it's no secret. God promised it in his word. King Frederick of Prussia asked his physician a question. Question is, why do you believe in the Bible? And his answer was, the Jews, your majesty. Because there's no doubt about it, the history of the Jews fulfilling Bible prophecy is an amazing testimony to the accuracy and the truth of the Bible. Yes, the bush has burned, but it's not been consumed. The Jews are a sign people. Isaiah 43 actually takes hold of the words of God where he actually said to them, you are my witnesses. Throughout history, many nations have set out to annihilate the Jews, to cut Israel off from being a nation. The Jews have been hounded, they've been harassed, they've been persecuted and massacred, and millions of graves have been dug to receive their dead. But they always rise up again, and they end up standing at the graveside of their persecutors. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those who curse you, God said. So the Jews are an indestructible people, and those who set out to destroy them end up getting destroyed themselves. The return of the Jews to their land and resuscitation of the once dead nation really is a miraculous phenomenon, unparalleled in human history. The nation had been dead for 2,000 years, just didn't exist, not on the map. And there they are again. It's a national resurrection. It's truly a national rising from the dead. And what could be more fitting than for Jewish archaeologists working on Masada, where the Jews made their last stand against the Romans for a free, independent nation, to find a scroll containing extracts from Ezekiel 37, the vision of the dry bones, which was better preserved and more easily read than all the other scrolls they found on Masada. And it hardly needs to be said that these scrolls, like the others, were virtually identical with the traditional text of our Bible. They are the only ones found in a geniza beneath the floor laid by the Zealots. This means that the date of the scrolls cannot possibly be later than 73 AD. And not even the most skeptical of scholars can challenge this. All in all, portions of 14 scrolls were found at Masada. It is biblical, sectarian, and apocryphal, and almost 700 inscriptions on pottery, mostly the names of the owners, including Herod, which was on a jar specially sent from Italy to him. According to Josephus, General Silva established a Roman garrison on the Masada summit after its conquest, a fact confirmed by excavations. And it could be assumed that this garrison would have disposed of the Jewish bodies in one way or another for sanitary reasons. From the very beginning of the excavation, the workers concerned themselves with the problem of finding the remains of the defenders. From the very outset, they searched for possible places. One of the sites was the network of caves near the top of the southern cliff of the Masada rock, only a few yards below the casement wall, near the two of the largest upper cisterns. It's to those caves that this gentleman on the screen here was lowering himself on a rope to see if the bodies of the defenders were put in there. In one of these caves, they came across skulls and other parts of skeletons scattered in disorder about the floor. There were about 25 skeletons altogether. The question was, had these been the bodies of zealots or troops of the Roman garrison, or some who lived or worked there during Herod's time, or even monks of the Byzantine period later? After the bones were carefully studied by the experts, the following facts were established. 14 of the skeletons were of males between the ages of 22 and 60. One was a man over 70. 6 were of females between the ages of 15 and 22. And 4 were of children aged from 8 to 12. And there was also one embryo. Due to the fact that the Romans and monks had no women or children with them, the skeletons would not have belonged to them. So they either belonged to Herod's servants or the Jewish defenders, probably the latter. They may have been put there by the Jews during the siege, when access to the cemetery was cut off. In no other place on Masada were additional skeletons found. Where the others were deposited by the Romans is not known. Among the ruins of the fortress were these ruins of a funerary building, the walls of which are filled with niches into which funeral urns were once placed, but have long since disappeared. Some say pigeons were kept there for meat. This picture here is an artist's impression of what Herod's Masada looked like in its heyday, before war and earthquake and centuries of neglect reduced it to ruins. There were only 2 ways up to the top, a short one from the west side, that is the right-hand side of our picture, where the Romans built the ramp, and the tortuous snake path up the east side, that is on the left side of our picture. Today, Masada has been made attractively accessible to modern tourists by the installation of a cable car that whisks visitors in minutes from the Dead Sea shore right up to the top of the plateau. It's much quicker and easier, of course, going by cable car than walking the more arduous snake path. And once one becomes familiar with the history, it's easy to come under the spell of Masada and readily understand why it has become such a major attraction for tourists. Thousands visit the fortress each year. The heroic stand of the Jewish zealots, their choice of death over slavery, and the burning of their humble chattels as a final act of defiance to the enemy has elevated Masada to an undying symbol of desperate courage, a symbol which has stirred hearts for many centuries. It is this which moves many visitors from nations around the world to make the ascent to Masada. It is this which has drawn the Jewish youth in their thousands to climb its summit in a solemn pilgrimage to reflect and to meditate. And it is this which brings recruits of the Israeli Defense Forces on a 60-kilometre hike to Masada and up the snake path to the top, where they swear the oath of allegiance with the poignant words, "Masada shall not fall again." This is the grand climax to their training. And in this picture, Israeli recruits are seen climaxing their training at a dramatic nighttime ceremony atop Masada, paying grim-lipped tribute to their zealot ancestors who died here 19 centuries ago. And finally, we see here torches lighting their way down as they descend the winding snake path.